Hi, everyone here and around the world. I'm happy to report that the live chat problem we had last week is now repaired. And tonight, author and documentary filmmaker Dan Drasin has kindly returned so we can now still have the live chat with all of you about his excellent and thought-provoking documentaries and his valuable book released in 2003 entitled, quote, A New Science of the Afterlife, Space, Time, and the Consciousness Code, close quote. That's Dan's research from his long-time investigations of consciousness and reincarnation. And it was about 3 months ago on December 6, 2024, that the UK Daily Mail headline, quote, Secret Pentagon Study Hints at Reincarnation Being Real After Finding Consciousness Never Dies, close quote. It is energy that cannot be destroyed. Here is the first of the 29-page secret Pentagon report written in June 1983, 42 years ago, entitled, quote, Approved for release on September 10, 2003, by CIA and Department of the Army's U.S. Army Operational Group of U.S. Army Intelligence and Security Command at Fort George Meade, Maryland. Department of Defense subject, analysis and assessment of gateway process, close quote. Well, that reference to the gateway process is to a consciousness training program developed in the 1970s by Robert Monroe, who founded the Monroe Institute after a career as a broadcasting executive. Robert Monroe became famous for his ideas about altered states of consciousness and teaching how to reach them. Our problem last week was loss of the Earthfiles chat, but to help make up for the loss of those live chat questions, Dan Drasin in San Francisco will be joining us live here at Earthfiles for your chat questions. But first, I want to show you an excerpt from Dan's truly excellent 2017 documentary, Calling Earth, that has just been chosen for the Life Beyond Life Film Festival. And Dan is going to join us live to answer your questions.
Now, according to science, when you physically die and when your brain stops functioning, that is it. That is the end. That's the end of consciousness.
One day in the summer of 2002, Martha Copeland of Lawrenceville, Georgia, played back a sound recording she'd made earlier that day and heard the voice of her daughter Kathy disciplining her dog. That wouldn't have been so unusual, except that 6 months earlier, Kathy had died in an auto accident. In September 2005, Vicki Talbot of Bellingham, Washington, received a message on her answering machine from her son, Braden.
Tuesday, 11 p.m.
Braden had been dead for over 4 years. In January 1994, Mark Macy of Boulder, Colorado, received a telephone call. The caller identified himself as a European psychologist named Konstantin Raudova.
This is Konstantin Raudova speaking.
Dr. Raudova had been dead for 20 years. One day in October 1987, Claude and Ellen Thorlund of Sweden switched on their TV. Suddenly, this strange image appeared, and they quickly snapped it with their Polaroid camera. Only later did they learn that their friend Friedrich Jürgensen, a pioneering afterlife researcher who had died a few days earlier, was being buried at that very moment, 250 miles away. For more than a half-century, people throughout the world claimed to have communicated with the dead using instruments of modern technology, such as tape recorders, radios, telephones, computers, and video systems. They call this phenomenon instrumental transcommunication, or ITC.
I think the reason that they choose to communicate with us like this is because this is the electronics age. This is what we accept.
The structure of the human voice.
In recent years, ITC has increasingly captured the attention of serious researchers, including doctors, engineers, and physicists, as well as scientific investigators of the paranormal. It has given rise to books, scientific reports, and international conferences held on both sides of the Atlantic. What's really going on here? Mainstream science tells us that nothing survives the death of our physical bodies. But that doesn't stop the flow of whispered voices, images, and verifiable information that seems to be flooding in from what some believe to be human minds inhabiting another dimension of existence. Is it possible that materialistic science has been misinterpreting the nature of human consciousness, and therefore dismissing valid evidence for the conscious survival of physical death?
Science is a method of inquiry, not an ideology. And at present there are many scientists who believe in materialism, but this is really a belief structure or a philosophy. And science as a method of inquiry doesn't have to be committed to a particular worldview.
Science appears to preclude the possibility of an afterlife, but science evolves and there's no knowing what possibilities may be acceptable to a future science.
After 26 years of doing research and investigation in this field, I've concluded that there's more than enough evidence that there is life after death, that we survive our bodies' deaths.
The notion that hard evidence for an afterlife might be staring us in the face may be a stretch for most scientists. But that hasn't discouraged many respected researchers from studying such phenomena as near-death and out-of-body experiences, reincarnation, mediumship, and instrumental transcommunication. At the grassroots of this growing movement, practitioners around the globe claim to be conversing with the deceased through the most common and accessible form of ITC. It's known as the electronic voice phenomenon.
A brief definition of the electronic voice phenomenon, or EVP as we call it, would be the existence of voices of unknown origin which appear in tape recordings particularly, but could also be recorded in other ways. When I first heard EVP, the EVP that I produced and I knew was real and not just something that people said, it changed my whole life in that I then really wanted to devote my work and what talents I have to researching this thing.
Electronics engineer Alexander McRae lives on the Isle of Skye off the coast of Scotland. A leading expert in voice communication systems, he developed speech enhancers for the Space Shuttle and voice links for the London Underground. When he first heard about EVP, he was convinced it was an alarming fraud aimed at exploiting the vulnerability of the bereaved.
I'd had a high-level security clearance in the UK and the US, so, I'd been into some quite fancy things, but I didn't believe this.
With his expertise in speech communications, he started recording EVP in an attempt to discredit it.
And then one evening, to my great surprise, with some equipment I was developing at the time, I heard a voice. My reaction was not fear, but something close to it. I was really startled.
McRae was even more amazed when he discovered additional voices on the same tape.
The first one was actually my father's voice. And what he said, I recognized the voice, what he said was a typical phrase that he used. He used it so much, in fact, that it became his nickname. So I became reasonably convinced that this was the electronic voice phenomenon that people had been talking about.
After 25 years of research, McRae is one of the world's leading experts in EVP.
What my research has convinced me is that there is another dimension to our existence, and that includes life after death.
And now let's go to England and Ian Holling, who has been gathering up questions for tonight's live chat about these fascinating subjects.
Say hello to Dan.
And are we there?
Hi, Linda. Yes, we are. Thank you for that. That's great to hear from you. It's one of the important things I wanted to mention here is someone in the audience referenced Dan from last week said that he'd actually had a physical contact with someone who had passed and felt that their hand was solid in a handshake.
That's right.
This person, Janet Bago, says, I met my dad after he passed. We hugged and he was solid. He spoke without speaking and gave facts I could verify. He also told me he was coming back. Perhaps we could hear Dan's experience of touching the deceased.
Yes.
And
Yeah, Dan, can you share with us? Dan is here with us in our Earthfiles YouTube. Dan Drasin has done such valuable work. I am so appreciative of being able to share these excerpts tonight. And I feel, Dan, that we are on one of those precipices that we could go a number of ways, having to do with consciousness, what kind of universe are we really in, how infinite is infinity, and in that, how many dimensions, how many universes forever. And in a strange way, that seems to be on the other side of this brilliant work that you have done with people who, in one way or another, have had an experience with afterlife. Can you tell one of your experiences?
Well, the experience that this gentleman has referred to, this took place back in 1967, and I was involved with some paranormal investigations with John Keel, who was one of the great paranormal investigators and writers at the time. And long story short, I went to visit him one evening. We lived close to each other in downtown Manhattan at the time. And when I arrived, he introduced me to an old friend of his who had shown up that evening, sort of out of nowhere. Joe had been a friend of John's previously, had been completely out of touch for some years, and strangely simply turned up at John's door that evening. So when I arrived, both John and Joe were there, and I met Joe. He was a tall guy. I'm about 6'1", and he was maybe 6'2". Big guy, dark hair, mustache, well-built. And the thing I remember about him most, in hindsight, was his firm handshake. Very extraordinarily firm handshake. Anyway, we chatted for a while, and then John and Joe went off to, it was actually a UFO conference in Manhattan that day. They went off to that. I went back home. So that was my meeting with Joe. It took place over maybe 5 minutes or so. Several years later, John ran into Joe's wife in Macy's department store and asked her, "Oh, how's Joe and where is he? I haven't been able to contact him." And his wife said, "Well, John, Joe's been dead for 5 years." And John said, "Well, oh, wait a minute. You know, I saw Joe 3 years ago. My friend Dan saw him." And his wife said, "No, come on, don't mess with me, John. You know, I was with him when he died. I attended his funeral." So John sort of walked away from this meeting with Joe's wife, puzzled and a little bit wrapped. And I mean, John has been very familiar with paranormal phenomena for years, but this one really threw him for a loop because Joe had been a personal friend of his, and Joe had kind of disappeared for some years. And after Joe left that night, John could no longer contact him. His phone had been disconnected, so on. He simply disappeared. So
that's basically the story. My perception of Joe was of a perfectly solid, perfectly real human being.
And that kind of either matter or energy shape shifting is part of also the extraterrestrial stories as they unfold through a variety of people and populations and countries, as if there is something that is mutable between the body matter world and something else that we would say was the subatomic, the electromagnetic, other frequencies, and that when you get into the extraterrestrial world or to near death, those are the kinds of, I'm going to say, pieces of what people have experienced that you wonder, well, what is the moment of death? And is, in some of these people, does it go on forever into some other kind of eternity? And the only interface that humans know is that moment, allegedly, of death. And along sort of these lines of what are we dealing with and issues of timelines and goals and motives, I had written down, ask Dan one more question. Why do you think that the other dimensional voices recorded here, like for example, that breathy and guttural, why do you think there would be any breathy or guttural or substantive sounds at all?
Well, that's a good question. We don't have a firm grasp of how this instrumental transcommunication actually works. It is sometimes, depending on who's on the other side communicating, it can be fairly reliable, but overall it's kind of hit and miss. We don't understand the physics of this form of communication. We have our own vocabularies, from our own both Newtonian physics and then also in quantum physics, but we don't really have a vocabulary for what's called the other side. My sense of it is that there's a whole other set of physics involved that don't really fit into the neat categories of our own.
And in the ET world, it would be suggested by physicists and others studying that there may be 12 dimensions.
Or
and
there
if there
may,
are 12
may,
dimensions and we're in one, what is in all the rest of it?
Right. We don't know how many dimensions there are. We can theorize till we're blue in the face, but we just don't know. If in fact the greater reality is literally infinite, then there theoretically could be an infinite number of dimensions or sets of realities or whatever you want to call them. When quantum physicists drill down into the very basics of our physical reality, they find certain things like constants way down at the bottom of the heap that cannot themselves be dissected or explained. And some folks have theorized that if you change any one of those constants, if you could change any one of those constants, the entire construct of reality would be in a different dimension.
And even more so, if those little constants were not there and always the same, there might not be a universe at all.
Well, I guess that's as good a theory as any. Excuse me, I got a bit of a cough this week.
All of us.
Yeah. So, but to get back to the question of communication, the metaphor that I use for electronic voice and video communications is imagine two railroad trains running on tracks that are basically parallel but kind of squiggly, so the trains move closer and farther apart and they're traveling at slightly different speeds. And imagine that there's only one open window in each train. You're trying to throw a spitball between one train and the other. At those quick moments when those windows happen to line up and the trains are closest enough together. That's why this sort of communication is hit and miss. There are all these factors of which we have no understanding that both impede or or make possible this communication. So it's a practice that people do, and the more you do it, apparently the better it works.
A question that kept ringing in the back of my head as I was reading some of your work was, have you ever had anyone who you've talked to who said they had an NDE, a near death, and resuscitated, in which they have described specifically non-humans around them from wherever they were? Have the two types of landscapes been mixed in any of the work that you've done?
Now, while I have not personally spoken with people who have described in detail other worlds, much of the afterlife communication that I have experienced, largely through a particular team of mediums that I've worked with for about 6 years now, what seems to be a common report from the other side is that once you've passed over, you've acclimated yourself to the rules of the game over there, which are based fundamentally on consciousness rather than matter. And once you have learned to master and control your own awareness and direct it where you choose to, and relate with those who you choose to, you have the option of traveling to not only to different planets, more or less as tourists. And this is something that Robert Monroe has discussed in some of his books. You also have the opportunity, depending on your own patterns of soul growth, to incarnate on other planets, in other life systems. And the extent to which these other life systems represent universes that we can't contact directly because they've got different fundamental constants, I have no idea. Mostly what people report are their experiences, and they can report them in great detail. But they don't necessarily have, they can't necessarily speak for the physics involved. Depends on their orientation. I suppose if a quantum physicist reported his experiences back, he might well have asked questions on some other planet or in some other reality system that he might be able to understand and translate into our language.
Well, the context of my question is in the frame of people who have worked in agencies or have worked on some classified programs, and they have said that they have seen material in which our government has information that at least 3 competing extraterrestrial civilizations have been fighting on or over or both Earth for 270 million years. And if you go all the way back to that point, then you have evolutionary history going forward into Denisovans and Neanderthal and Cro-Magnon and Homo sapien. And that the bottom line about Earth is that it is used as a genetic manipulation lab. But who is in control of which experiment and which exercise? And right now, as we are, I think most people feel, approaching a very dangerous time on planet Earth, if there are non-humans who might make a change for the positive, and we're still not being introduced to extraterrestrial biological entities and their artificial intelligence in a public way, what keeps holding that back? And some people who have worked in aerospace and others say part of the issue has to do with recycling in other dimensions extraterrestrial civilizations that are completely different in terms of how we look at birth, life, death, and a universe that may have 100 dimensional frequencies. And we are in one where we can't get along.
Well, I wish I had the wisdom to answer all those questions. The focus of my research has been, you might say, a little more modest in focusing on people's experiences and their own reports from their own experiences of transitioning to the other side and reporting from the other side. Now, I haven't asked many questions along the lines that are your focus. So I have to say I'm limited in my ability to answer that. There are some folks who report all kinds of phenomena that are, for example, one young woman from the Bay Area who had a really amazing near-death experience some years ago reports that when she was on the other side, she could, and she doesn't have a mathematical bone in her body, but when she was on the other side, she claimed she was able to understand the mathematics of creation. It was just plain and obvious to her from that perspective. She couldn't bring it back here into her more limited physical body and identity. So, that sort of thing alone raises a huge number of questions. And, I wish I could answer these larger questions about the cosmic power structure, if you will. But it's a little outside of my expertise.
Well, I remember a few years ago when we first met, I think at a conference, and it might have been a UFO conference. We've had discussions about UFOs and ETs. And when it gets into frequencies, life frequencies, no life frequencies, that comes up so much when you're dealing with abductees, animal mutilations, all of it, having to do with what humans have experiences with extraterrestrials, whether outside on riding a horse and something that looks like a standing up alligator suddenly rises and the horse rears back and falls and the person on the horse falls, and they live to tell the story of what they saw and what the horse saw, but it's hard to prove. And we keep coming up to these dividing lines that include a headline just a couple of weeks ago in a news article about how we are in a universe that some physics and formulas, when applied to what we're seeing in terms of a matter universe, the headline was, scientists have found information this universe should not exist. So how far does this landscape go with different extraterrestrial civilizations, humanity on planet Earth that may or may not survive itself, and into a universe where the whole, in some of the extraterrestrials, the recycling of what they would call the life force in and out of a soul, in and out of a matter body, in and out of different dimensional frequencies, and that's where the true game is played. And here on Earth, we haven't even been told the truth about extraterrestrials. What is your perspective, thinking in terms of if you go to reincarnation, you are getting into that twilight zone of something that is unseen and untouchable, but has been part of literature and dialogue about the uniqueness of humans having powerful souls that might be a plasma or energy that evolves in other dimensions, and that in the last few dozen years there have been people in the human abduction syndrome who say at the moment of death we are not understanding what happens with the cycle of, let's say, we'll call it the words soul energy, recycles back into the big consciousness with a C, and that's the true huge game. But we're not really educated in all of the details as a human species on Earth.
Well, that I would agree, and there's a great deal of information out there from people who have returned from the other side and who routinely communicate from the other side, largely through talented mediums. And I think it's fair to say that there are, to put it very simply, that there are levels of energy in the afterlife. That when most of us pass over, we will find ourselves in a very sort of Earth-like environment. It's made of consciousness, but from our perception, the point of our perception, it's quite Earth-like. And we can meet friends, deceased relatives, those who've been on the other side for a while. in the form of, you might say, energy bodies that resemble their Earth bodies during the prime of their lives. That's the typical description we see.
But they're not matter. It's an energy. It's like shape-shifting in the sense that there's something that might reflect, but it's not matter.
Yeah, Jürgen Ziva calls them our avatars, our forms in which we communicate. But from the experiencer's point of view on the other side, they're solid. From the earthly perspective, they would be etheric, or however you want to term it. But from the experience over there, it's quite solid, which raises the question of whether our material universe and our material experience is itself a sort of an energy construct that only seems to be solid from the point of view of our own senses and our own local physics. But that's a whole other area. Beyond the say the landing place on the other side, which has quite perceivably physical attributes to it. There are said to be any number of levels beyond that we can arrive at depending on our own growth of our soul, the maturing of our soul. There's a wonderful book that I wonder if you've seen. It's T.E.Lawrence's Post-Mortem Journal. T.E.Lawrence was known as Lawrence of Arabia. He lived a very interesting life involving a persona that he had created that was larger than life. When he passed over, he discovered a great deal about what lies beyond the ego and the persona.
How did he describe it?
Well, I would refer you and your viewers and listeners to this book. It's called Post-Mortem Journal. And the nominal author is Jane Sherwood, who was the medium who brought this book through over a number of years. It's one of my favorite books. I reread it every year. And it's got some wonderful basic information about how one perceives the afterlife when one passes over there. There's also a wonderful movie called, in Portuguese, it's called No Solar. Astral City is the English name of it. It was written by a well-known Brazilian medium, Chico Xavier, who was a well-known writer and philanthropist during his lifetime. And this movie was made out of one of many of the books that he had written. And it's the story of a wealthy man who passes over and gets to look back at his life and gets to heal from his own inflated and hardened ego, you might say. He ends up evolving into a very lovely person by the end of the film. It's online. I think you can see it, or at least see the trailer on YouTube. So it's either No Solar, N-O-S-S-O-L-A-R, it's the original Portuguese title, or Astral City, which is the English title. It's a feature-length film. And it represents, I think, fairly well what a lot of people report from the afterlife in terms of its seeming solidity, the different kinds of relationships that can take place over there, the learning experience, which continues on from where we left off our physical lives. And it's also a really fun, interesting film to watch. Some of it was filmed in Brasilia, the Brazilian capital, that has some really wonderful advanced architecture, which represented this sort of holy city on the other side, you might say.
Well, let's check in with Ian and see if we have some good questions now in the chat, Ian.
Hi, Linda. Yeah, thanks for that. With the communications via electronic media, that's an interesting one that's referenced by people here. Dr. Dolores Meisey says, but civilians could only pick up EVP once digital communications happens, right? Well, that's not necessarily true that it's digital communications, because some of us remember the book by D. Scott Rogo and Raymond Bayliss, Phone Calls from the Dead. That was 1979. And the messages that Dan played earlier in his documentary were referencing all of those as well. People have mentioning in the chat their own experiences and how sometimes these people have limited speech. Tao says, when my father died in 1995, after 2 weeks, we used to get phone calls from our father at our house. We were terrified. His voice was very slow, trying to speak slow in a slow voice. This is just the actual physical communication that they're able to do with this, whether or not it's whether or not they have limited energy to do so. Perhaps Dan could comment on that.
That's a very good question. My understanding is that it's a highly individual question. Does depend on the energy of the folks on the other side, depends to some extent on our energy here and our receptiveness to the communications. It also depends on factors we have no idea about. You might say space weather. Who knows? Some people claim that electronic communication works best during the waxing phase of the moon. We don't know for sure because there has not been the resources to do this kind of large-scale research that would need to be done to determine these things. We do know a few things that enhance our chances of communication. One is, of course, if we have an emotional bond with a particular person on the other side. It's also been suggested that if we try to communicate the same time every day, say in the quiet time of the evening, and do it repeatedly that same time of day, that will tend to excuse me, that will tend to increase our chances of connecting. As far as the technology is concerned, it's a toss-up. So many people have had success with old-fashioned cassette recorders. It's apparently not a digital process per se, and we don't know how and where the voices enter into our electronic devices. And whether knowing that would be a help or not, I have no idea, because there has not been the possibility of really, you might say, clinical trials to really study the technology. But all else being equal, we know that that a focused intention, preferably simple technology, which can be your smartphone or your computer or an old-fashioned cassette tape recorder. As long as you feel comfortable with the technology and familiar with it, that's the ideal situation. And I think those are the basics, really. It's less a technical process than an inner process. And the physical barriers that may be there, we just don't have sufficient understanding of those.
And Dan, did you hear or see the interview? It was on television when Steve Jobs died. His wife was by his side. I think she said she was holding his left hand, and he was on a hospital bed. And he had been completely silent, quiet. And all of a sudden, she felt a squeeze on her hand and said that Steve Jobs, from lying flat, came right straight up to a sitting position, looking at a place in front, saying with breathy, "Oh, wow. Oh, wow. Oh, wow." And I can do it because I'm remembering seeing this interview. And then he laid right back down. And she was sitting there in complete and total stun at what had happened.
Yes, I'm familiar with that story. It's lovely, and it's common. That these kinds of phenomena occur routinely in hospitals and in terminal in hospice conditions and so on. The problem, it's one of these things we call paranormal only because we can't talk about it openly. It's perfectly normal. A lot of this stuff is so perfectly normal. And, with regard to experiences of the dying, there's even this phenomenon called the shared death experience. There are whole studies of it now. There's a whole institute devoted to it. And this is where folks at the deathbed, they may be hospice workers or nurses or relatives, will experience there's several forms of it. One form is where folks accompany the dying person into the first stage of the afterlife. It's a complete shock to them, but it's a lovely experience. At other times, folks at the deathbed may share some of the visions that the dying person has. And I mean, it depends on the individual and the circumstances and so on. But this is quite common. And there's some, if your listeners will go to a particular website that I and my colleagues have created, they can find some really lovely accounts from the other side of the dying process. The website is cosmicvoices.network. It's Cosmic Voices, one word, .network. And this is a site that my team of mediums has been putting together over the last 5 years. I'm sort of the curator and webmaster of it. But if you go to the messages page, you see two columns. One is messages from names that you would know, prominent people in politics, in the arts, actors, and so on. And there's another column of folks whose names you wouldn't recognize. But you can go down and just read these accounts. And after you've read at least half a dozen of them, I think you'll get a fair assessment of, a fair idea of what's common to these experiences and what is strictly individual and unique to the dying individual. Well, Linda, I wish I could hear your question, but I don't hear your audio. So let me call you on the phone so I can hear you, all right? Okay, I can hear you now. Can you hear me?
Now,
I
can sort of hear you.
Can you guys hear me through my microphone?
Brad, should I just keep him on the phone to then? We don't know what happened. If you can hear me, and Brad, do you think you're picking up?
Okay.
Go ahead and just based on what you have gathered in the website, what do you think might now be
I'm sorry, I still can't hear you now. I can't hear you now that you've hung up the phone. Can you hear me? Could you just give me a thumbs up if you can hear me? Okay, but I can't hear you. So let me So if you pick up I can't hear you.
Hello?
Okay, now I can hear you over the phone.
Okay.
So can you hear me properly? Hello? Hello? But I can't hear you. I can't hear you unless you're talking directly into the telephone.
I can hear you in my left ear.
Okay, good. So let's stay on the phone, otherwise I can't hear you.
Okay.
All right.
What do you think, just to go past these technical problems 2 weeks in a row,
Yeah.
what if we're being attacked by something? What do you think is on the other side of either Steve Jobs or anyone else who would be saying, would be saying, "Oh wow, oh wow, oh wow." Just pause for a second. Ian, what is it? We're trying to figure out whether to keep growing.
I'm getting messages in the chat that can't in the chat. You can use your mic. That you're the one.
So what's happening with my mic?
Oh, I can hear you now, Linda.
All right.
Okay, so I'm going to
Do
hang
I
up.
do I hang up? Do I hang up the phone?
Your mic went off.
Yeah. Okay, good. Now I can hear you.
Well, it was just some communication with him. Well,
Okay. So what was
like
the-
everything else in the universe, some things are predictable and others are not.
Right.
Before we close out, do you think now in this respite where we can hear each other for a little bit, what do you yourself envision would be on the other side of those oh wows?
My sense of it, Linda, is it's not just what people see. It's their very experience of existence that shifts into what we might term a more kind of ecstatic level of being, a less limited level of being. And especially, given all our conditioning on this side, when we're exposed to the other side, there are whole other levels of perception that open up to us. And many people describe hearing sounds and seeing colors and having sensory experiences that just aren't part of our physical spectrum normally. So it's hard to put into language because our languages basically are based on our earthly experience. They're
On this
our-
3D world that we're in, yeah.
Right. I mean, we can get poetic and give hints about what we might call a higher or more subtle experience, but you have to be there, as it were, to really get the full experience. And this is what we're told over and over and over again in communications from the other side. Okay, now I can no longer hear you now. So I can't hear you, Linda, so I'm going to dial you up again.
Answer the phone, talk to her.
Is this Dan?
Yes, now I can hear you.
Yeah. We do not know exactly what is happening or why. Brad is trying to work on the chords, but I would say this is second time. Let's try to organize a third program in which our goal will be perfect technology.
Okay, let's do it.
And Brad, should we go ahead and say good night?
Go ahead and take another question.
Well, I just want to add.
Ian, do you have a final question that you could describe from something that you have? Is he in there?
Yeah, basically it's a very important. Yeah, can you let?
Go ahead, because we have the time.
If it'll just continue to broadcast. Yeah. We're being, piece by piece, everything that makes sound is being wiped out.
Are you hearing me?
I'm hearing you.
Are you?
I guess
For whatever reason,
we are being
short tonight, like last week too. And
Well-
we've got to find a way to continue to be able to do the video as well as audio without problems. So Brad is trying to work on equipment now.
but nothing is coming into focus.
Okay, I can hear you now directly.
Okay.
So I'm going to hang up.
All right. Now,
All
if I hang up, can you now? Are we back hooked through the microphones?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, and I can hear you directly.
Well, maybe it was a test. Will they give up?
Well, this raises another interesting question, and that is that folks on the other side, under the right conditions, can mess with our technology.
Huh.
I call it metaphysical hanky panky, and probably the most common form of that is when folks on the other side will switch our lights on and off. It's happened to me. It's happened to friends of mine, and it's evidently fairly easy for them to do that sort of thing.
Apparently
the right
Brad is identifying something that keeps repeating, whether it's battery or something. It's being impacted, and we normally don't have these kinds of problems. Is it because we're having the famous Dan Drasin, who is helping the world to understand different dimensions, frequencies?
I wish I could answer that.
Well,
and I actually, not only have we had audio problems, but I have not been able to see myself at all during this conversation. So
maybe I'm targeted. It wouldn't surprise me if
it's just a battery problem.
But you would think that being able to talk about dimensional frequencies, and we'll say this body of information that has been gathered by humans for centuries about what does happen at the moment of death. And in reading your great book, A New Science of the Afterlife, Space-Time and the Consciousness Code, and going to the very last pages to check on your quotes, I think it is fascinating to find that Walt Whitman, the famous American poet, said essentially about experiencing life and death, all goes onward and outward, nothing collapses, and to die is different from what anyone supposed and luckier. It was that last word, luckier, by Walt Whitman. And I thought, I wonder what he had experienced in his life up to what we would call his passing. And that the idea that there are energy systems and frequencies so far beyond what our ears and our eyes can see. And that if we're in a universe that recently the headlines have been in many places, that they're finding physical evidence. And quote, one of the headlines in a newspaper a couple of weeks ago was, "This universe should not exist." I thought that was one of the most perfect headline summaries for the 20th and the 21st century, when humans have been stumbling out of ignorance, whether formally or by accident, to be told by a variety of other humans in a lot of different human occupations that we're not alone in this universe, that there are extraterrestrials that are biological, there's lots that is artificial intelligence that may be driving what is happening on our Earth. And yet, we are now still at a crossroads where the truth about our not being alone, the truth about other extraterrestrial intelligences, is clearly so thick in discussions that I've had with people off the record.
Hello.
Okay, now I can hear you. Your audio cut out suddenly. It sounded like a bad microphone connection, or something. There was a click as if a connection were interrupted.
Well, I am trying to understand if I should just say thank you, Dan Drasin, for hanging in there in what turned out not to be a normal program at all, and that we reschedule to talk about some of this, and especially with somebody who has had insights about the moment of death. And there is one that I'd like to just close out, leaving to you to think about and to comment. In my book, Glimpses of Other Realities, Volume 2, there's a 106-page section with illustrations by a variety of people, humble humans like you, I, and all of us, just humans. But they were abducted by a combination of greys, praying mantises, swans, talls. And they were shown rooms with glass tubes, large glass tubes for some. Some of the beings in the glass tubes were 7 or 8 feet tall. Others were much shorter. It was a mixture. And
one of the women that I focused on, now I'm getting an echo in here.
Okay, that's okay. Now I can hear you directly.
This is really important too. You think I can get out one last puzzle?
All right.
Am I talking with Dan now? This last piece has always haunted me. I began investigating extraterrestrials, animal mutilations, abductions back in 1979. And this discussion with these very good illustrations with a variety of people was in 89, 90, 91, 92. And the illustrations that people were sending me and handing me at conferences during that time period, I wondered why, what was happening, why would they suddenly have this, we'll say, a brand new theme in abductions in which many people were reporting seeing bodies in these glass tubes. It was only approximately 5 years ago that this abductee, still alive on planet Earth, called me and said, "Linda, you will never believe what has happened. I died last week and they brought me back. Linda, I saw a tunnel, I saw a light, and right beyond the light was exactly the same tube with exactly the same being that I was shown back in the 1980s to 1990s. Mm. And she said to me, "What do you think that means?" And I have been haunted by her statement and her question. I'll throw it back to you right now, to the audience remaining, because I really do think that it is significant. What do you think it would mean if there are bodies preserved in tubes and that a human goes through, for reasons unknown, a near-death experience and vividly remembers seeing one of the bodies in tubes that she saw in a big UFO? What do you think that would imply about what's going on between ETs, humans, and Earth?
Well, the first question I'd ask is, what did it mean to her? Did she have some kind of an inner sense of what that meant in terms of her own experience?
She was not afraid. She was not in a negative. It was more the exploration of Linda, right in front of me, and she was in a nursing home, and she had a heart problem, and she had collapsed, and they had brought her back, and that's what she remembered. And I've always thought, what are we missing? What is the significance of this and other cases? Not that we're going to solve anything, but I'm bringing it up in this larger box of the moment of death. If it's a transition, if it's not extinction, if it's transition, how many transition locations could there be? And what would it mean if something being kept in a UFO, clearly on a UFO, in a glass jar, ended up being what she saw after she had collapsed?
Well, did she have a feeling that she had some connection with that particular body? Or was it just an object to her?
No, she did. In the large chapter, she felt that and there was a male eventually that she would meet in one of the tubes as well. And she had this sense that there was some sort of a genetic connection between her female and that male in those tubes, but without understanding. That's why she called me. And I don't believe that she has survived in these 5 years. But it has left me with wondering how much more complex can the whole relationship between soul, body, matter, very strange and unexpected formula that seemed to be at the base of this universe. Physicists who are now saying, this universe shouldn't exist. There are just so many unexpected unknowns now.
Yeah.
And we are, and why I feel it is so important to discuss all of these things in depth, is we're not going to escape off of our own planet if we continue in conflict as Homo sapien. What a loss that would be. Well, listen, on that note, agape hug to you, agape hug to everybody who is here for the Earthfiles, and may, in a much shorter time than any of us have thought, may we end all of these wars and try to live together on a planet where everybody is trying to pull for everybody else in the most positive way possible. Thank you, Dan Drasin. Thank you for your remarkable work. And we will hopefully be able to do another interview at some point in the future as your film goes forward and gets this award, which you so much deserve. It's a beautiful, Calling Earth is a wonderful film.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for just staying here throughout all these technical problems. It's so weird because last week we had problems and we thought we were clearing everything up. Just never give up. No matter what is happening, never give up. See ya.
Bye, Linda. Thank you.
Turn on closed captions for YouTube videos by clicking the white CC button on the lower right. The default language for Linda's videos is English. If you would like to see the captions in another language, click on the white settings button next to the CC button. Select Subtitles CC and then select Auto Translate. Select a language, and the captions will now appear in that language.
Sort of gone through, and they will hold their heads. I never had a cat do that before. And they'll pull against the comb, helping me get out snarls. And I think it's the best they've ever been.